Thank you, Hugh, for that introduction. It's always great to be in Austin, and it's great to be here at South by Southwest, particularly for the 20th anniversary of South by Southwest Interactive. A lot has happened in the last 20 years on this stage, and in all of our lives, particularly as it relates to technology. 20 years ago, probably some of you weren't born. I was 14, and by that point, I'd had a computer for just under half my life, thanks to Santa Claus giving me a Commodore in 1987. So thank you, Santa Claus. I remember when I sent my first email in high school, and I remember when my dad sent his first email to John Glenn, who was then orbiting in space, something he's still ridiculously and rather sweetly proud of today. He's now a pretty good tweeter and a pretty good texter, but he still has only ever sent 2 emails. I remember when my parents and I each got a cell phone, and I'm certainly not surprised that my mother is our family's cleverest and most famous texter. Oh yeah, you can always applaud for my mother, absolutely. And I'm unapologetically biased towards both my parents. I'm also pretty biased towards my husband, who, when we were at Stanford, and he was then just my friend, told me one day he had turned down a summer job because why on earth would he want to go work for a startup web browser and search engine when Netscape would clearly never be dethroned? And so now we tease him that if he'd said yes to Sergey in our family, we all might look like that. But on a slightly more serious note, what I want to talk about today is how technology has disrupted and how technology has yet to disrupt how organizations and individuals work to advance positive change in the world. What is irrefutably true is that technology has disrupted the very nature of how we can improve the world by empowering individuals to make a difference. At the Clinton Foundation, we spend a lot of time, as you heard in Hugh's introduction, thinking about where we are positioned to uniquely make a positive difference, whether because of our ability to convene unlikely partners or to change market dynamics, whether in health or agriculture commodities, or because we think that we can do something more cheaply and better than it's being done otherwise. We also work to be disciplined about thinking about the areas that we're not uniquely positioned to make a difference in. And we spend a fair bit of time thinking about how technology can help advance our work or how it can't yet. As Ben Rattray from Change.org talked about on Friday, a lot has changed in the ways in which we, whomever the we are, engage in the world around us. But there's still areas in the development space where technology is just beginning to push disruption and innovation. A quick history lesson to have a sense, though, of how far we've come. This is the original care package. It contained a variety of staples like powdered milk, cornmeal, lard, and Spam. And although Spam gets a bad reputation today, at the time it was pretty innovative because it didn't need to be refrigerated and had a long shelf life. When CARE, the organization, was started in 1945, its goal was to rush life-saving supplies to the survivors of World War II. Thousands of Americans sent more than 100 million care packages to Europe until the program was discontinued in the early 1960s. It was the individual and NGO complement to the larger US government program, the Marshall Plan. And while today, the only place you'll find an original care package is in the Smithsonian, CARE was at the time innovative and disruptive, even beyond Spam. When the US government sent food aid to Europe during and after World War I, American women could decorate the packages, but individual Americans couldn't send their own. CARE was a collaboration between 22 smaller organizations that for the first time on a large scale enabled individual Americans to help others across the world. Still, throughout most of the 20th century, even post-World War II, individuals who wanted to engage in philanthropy had limited ways to do so. Governments were the main source of aid, and the only major non-governmental actors were big foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation. but they were still in the minority. Today, however, although government donors like the United States, United Kingdom, and Japan still are the predominant players, increasingly there are more contributions and competition coming from more places. In the health space, for example, government donors still account for more than 70% of the dollars invested, but that percentage is shrinking year after year. Today, development assistance is being defined and redefined by the increasingly dense interactions between governments, non-governmental organizations, for-profit companies, and individuals together. And while it's clear that citizen engagement in democracies and autocracies today looks very different than when my grandmother sent care packages to Europe, as seen from Tahrir Square to Taksim Square to Independence Square, even more has changed. Giving, volunteering, and contributing all have been democratized like never before. So what does this democratization look like? Because greater connectivity, greater knowledge, greater awareness on their own are not necessarily disruptive or democratizing. The world saw massive campaigns for famine relief, from Somalia to India, massive campaigns against nuclear weapons, far before the advent of the internet or mobile phones. What has changed is that today we have more options and more outlets to engage directly and to influence our governments, our non-governmental organizations, and for-profit companies than ever before. For example, in social media, even if someone can't join with the people who are standing outside the Supreme Court to voice support for equal marriage rights, we can change our Facebook page. We also can still sign petitions, tweet support, and call our congressmen or women. Or in disaster response. Within 2 hours of the Haitian earthquake in 2010, the State Department had set up the Text 90999 campaign and went on to raise more than $40 million to support the Red Cross's Haitian earthquake disaster relief efforts. But even more impressive, within a few weeks, more than half of American households had contributed via SMS to some type of Haitian earthquake relief, percentages never seen before in traditional telethons or fundraising drives. And while text-to-give platforms aren't yet as successful in supporting non-emergency issues, crowdfunding sites like CrowdRise and Indiegogo are increasingly filling that gap, enabling us to aggregate funding to support the causes that we deem worthy, either because of who's doing the work, who's supporting the work, or what the work aims to accomplish. And Kiva enables individuals to make small loans to entrepreneurs, generally women, across the world. To date, more than 1 million people have given more than $538 million in loans to support more than 1.2 million entrepreneurs in 73 countries, including here in the United States, in cities like Detroit and Little Rock, where I'm from originally. It's a great example of an innovation developed in the developed world to disrupt the developing world that traveled back again to disrupt the developed. And new solutions continue to emerge to inform, engage, inspire, and empower people from within the developing world itself. In Africa, for example, home to 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the last decade, and 7 of the 10 fastest growing by 2015, the digital picture is changing rapidly. Most people have a mobile device, not yet a smartphone, but 3G and broadband penetration are growing rapidly. And new services and new products are following or leading those trends. A tech startup called Saya out of Ghana was the first African startup to present at TechCrunch Disrupt in 2012. Saya is a little bit like WhatsApp, except that it runs on a feature or non-smartphone. It's currently in 35 countries, and it's growing rapidly. Fast Company posted a story yesterday online about a company called Brick, a startup out of Nairobi that's developing a backup generator for the internet, something I wish that I could carry around in my pocket here in the United States. Arguably the best known and most transformative tool is M-Pesa. It's a mobile banking system in Kenya that enables Kenyans who otherwise wouldn't be enfranchised in their financial services system to do so and to be so. Today, it's being used by 17 million Kenyans, on more than 2/3 of the adult population in the country. Last year, more than 25% of the country's GDP flowed through M-Pesa, up from 0% in 2007, an enviable growth rate. M-Pesa started off as a collaboration between a traditional aid agency, DFID, the UK Development Agency, and Vodafone. Today, it's a standalone, for-profit, incredibly profitable company that's expanding rapidly and being copied across East Africa. And in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and India, people are using text messaging services to verify whether or not the drugs they're considering purchasing are counterfeit, thanks to a company called Sxsw that actually emerged from a Clinton Global Initiative University commitment in 2009. The World Health Organization estimates that up to 25% of the drugs in the developing world are counterfeit, and that collectively they account for about 700,000 deaths a year. Sxsw has already verified more than 5 million drug purchases, and the technology is now expanded into other areas, verifying cosmetics in Ghana, automotive parts in India, and electrical cables in Kenya. I've also seen how mobile technology can improve and disrupt the delivery of care, and I'm thrilled that health and healthcare have been such areas of focus this year at South by Southwest, and that so much innovation is already emerging in the developing world in these areas. In Ethiopia, the Clinton Health Access Initiative has started an electronic database of all pregnant women in the country, whether they're first seen at a rural health clinic or an urban health center. The database automatically calculates the estimated delivery date for each woman and then sends SMS reminders to community healthcare workers so that they can check on the expectant mothers at crucial intervals throughout their pregnancy, all with the goal of reducing maternal mortality. I wish we had a similar unitary system here in the United States. We clearly have a lot to learn from what's happening across Africa in development assistance, in financial services, in healthcare, and in agriculture. The mobile app iCow is a text messaging and voice-based phone app created by a Kenyan organic dairy farmer and a Kenyan app developer. It helps dairy farmers track the fertility cycles of their cows. And today it's being used by more than 30,000 farmers and has helped improve the yield of the dairy cows by more than 200% in less than 3 years. iCow isn't an app that you can buy in the App Store. It's SMS-based and designed to work on the type of phone that I used when I was at Stanford, literally. Innovation isn't always new. Technology isn't just a disruptor of traditional modes of engagement and philanthropy. At its best, it's a disruptor of systems, whether the formal economy or healthcare delivery. It's not fundamentally important because it's new. It's fundamentally important because it's changing how we think about solving problems and who is empowered to solve those problems. That type of thinking and imagining is still relatively new to the development space. One area where technology has clearly played a disruptive role, and an area that's received a lot of attention so far here at South by, is increasing transparency and accountability for governments. In development, we often know in which countries donor governments, companies, or NGOs are making investments, but we often don't know in whom they're investing to do the work or what the ultimate outcomes of the work are. And so that brings me to what technology hasn't yet disrupted, at least in the development space, and the opportunity for disruption that remains. And candidly, I hope that's where all of you come in. Because ultimately, technology has the potential to revolutionize the way in which development measures, reports, and analyzes the successes and failures of its work. We need a greater emphasis on not just understanding dollars invested, but in results, in what works and what doesn't. Nowhere, for example, is there what I would call a solutions hub, a place where I can go and look up what solutions or strategies have been proven to be most successful, whether in maternal health care, in rural parts of low-income countries, or in helping to train or empower smallholder farmers throughout the developing world. The Clinton Foundation does work in both those areas, and I know the work that we're doing has impact. because we're obsessed with data and tracking our results. But I'd like to know if we're the best or not. When starting a business, metrics, data, and comparative assessment are by definition part of what one has to do, partly because you're accountable to investors, but partly because standardized metrics exist. You know what SG&A means, what cost of goods sold means. You have to calculate net income and EBITDA. There are no such standardized metrics in the development space. There's no way to track which of our services or which of our products are really making a difference and which aren't. And there's also, candidly, not a lot of transparency. And most people and most organizations don't talk about failure. It's an area where I think that we in development, and candidly, in most sectors, could learn a lot from the tech space. People are often far too skittish to talk about failure. It's one of the reasons I'm proud that we at the Clinton Foundation are transparent with all of our partners, and we're very candid about our failures, something I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A if you're interested. And on the transparency front, efforts like the International Aid Transparency Initiative and the Aid Transparency Index are encouraging donors to share previously opaque data around how much money is being invested, in whom, and where, and they're trying to standardize the metrics being used to track and report success. But it's still very hard. USAID, for example, is a very opaque part of the American government. So although these efforts are making some inroads, we still have a long ways to go. And there's another challenge, the massive data gap that exists in development. It's hard to standardize data that doesn't exist. It's one of the reasons we spend so much time on data and metrics at the Clinton Foundation, because in many places, if we didn't collect it ourselves, we couldn't rely on it being reliable or robust. In general, we don't know with anything approaching precision the size of the challenges we're confronting. In the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, approximately 2/3 of births aren't recorded. Those children that aren't part of the development indicators today or in the future. That's an extreme example, but not a unique one. That's partly why at the Clinton Foundation, my mother and I are currently working on something that we call the No Ceilings Full Participation Project. And we're focused on assessing the gains and gaps in rights and opportunities for women and girls from 1995 until 2015. How far have we come, or how far do we still have to go to ensure that every girl and every woman can fully participate in the economic, social, political, and cultural lives of our communities and our countries? As part of No Ceilings, we've partnered with the Gates Foundation to aggregate data from traditional sources like the UN, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and less traditional development sources like Google and all the major telecom companies throughout sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, so that we really can have the best available data to aggregate and to analyze how far girls and women have come and how far we have to go, including with respect to technology and technology usage. We're also committed to ensuring that the data that we gather and the insights that we glean will be freely accessible, freely available, and usable, and that at least major parts of the data and the insights will be accessible on SMS-only platforms throughout the developing world. Because we want the data and the insights to be used by those who are most affected by the most pernicious and persistent gaps, although we're clear that no country, including our own, has achieved full participation. And we know we need even more partners than we already have to help us ensure that we have the data we need to fully understand how technology is being used by girls and women in the developed and the developing world, and to look for correlations between technology usage, mobile usage, app usage by women and girls, and either expanding or, unfortunately, contracting rights and opportunities for women and girls. And what I'm talking about here today and across all of my work at the Clinton Foundation is work that I'm deeply passionate about. And I'm also deeply in awe of the trend that is growing faster and going further, that each one of us really can make a difference in the world. So how do we do that? It's a question I've grappled with my entire life. And every day I try to answer it thinking about my grandmother. Yes, the same one who sent care packages to Europe. And what she always said to me, that life is not about what happens to you, but about what you do with what happens to you. And she meant that as someone who was born before women had the right to vote in the United States, who had been abandoned by her parents twice before the age of 8, and who had to go to work to support herself as soon as she turned 13. But she also meant it as someone who built a home full of love and support for her children, someone who volunteered regularly until she grew too weak to do so, and someone who lived to be able to vote for her daughter for president. And so today, I try to think about where can I make a unique and hopefully positive contribution. And so I spend my time working in areas where I think that's true, whether it's in childhood obesity, juvenile justice health, or HIV/AIDS here in the United States, or in HIV/AIDS, smallholder farmer economics, or childhood diarrhea around the world. And so I'd finish today by asking each one of you what you will do with your power and your platforms to make a positive contribution. If it's in the women and girls space, I hope you'll join us at No Ceilings. If you feel compelled to work on the challenges of transparency and accountability in the development space, I certainly hope you'll do that. And if it's something else altogether, I hope you'll find an organization that you think is responsible and dynamic enough to deserve your talents, your energies, your ideas, and your ingenuity. I can't wait to see what happens next. Thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to our contribution.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to introduce to the stage Bob Safian of Fast Company.
How are you? I'm
great.
You need a little water.
I do need some water.
Yeah, that's all right. It's clean water.
I'm sure it's clean water.
That's a good thing. It's not available everywhere in the world.
Not available everywhere in the world. It's something that we are lucky enough to take for granted here.
It's true. We do take it for
So
granted.
does that mean you're going to let me talk about childhood diarrhea?
We
I
go
think
right
so.
to the bathroom, huh?
I think
Right
so.
to the toilet talk. All right, go ahead. Well, you go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Bob. So I'm obsessed with diarrhea. And I will find like quite specious ways to be able to talk about diarrhea. And you're not all going to be laughing by the time I finish because you're also going to realize how serious it is. But one of the reasons I talk a lot about diarrhea is because it doesn't make me squeamish. And it makes a lot of people squeamish. And I find the fact that more than 750,000 children still die every year around the world because of severe dehydration due to diarrhea unacceptable. And the reason that no longer happens here in the United States is because we have clean water, largely. So at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900 in New York City, and this was probably equally true in Austin, Texas, the leading causes of childhood death were pneumonia, tuberculosis, and severe dehydration due to diarrhea. The difference in New York City and in much of the United States versus a lot of the developing world today is that the vested interests had a vested interest in changing that. Because the people in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which in 1900 was the most densely populated place on earth, when their kids got sick, the kids of the people who lived in Midtown or the Upper East Side, they got sick too. And so people like J.P. Morgan bought a lot of public bonds in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century to build clean water and clean sewage systems. So while we hopefully wait for that to happen in the developing world, the introduction of public health solutions, we have to do whatever we can to ensure that no child dies of diarrhea. And see, none of you are laughing. So at the Clinton Foundation, we're very focused on changing the market dynamics around the treatment for severe dehydration due to diarrhea, which is something called oral rehydration solutions and zinc. So for example, when we started working in Nigeria a couple years ago, a single packet cost about $8. Cost prohibitive to most mothers. But there also was only about a 1% market penetration. And so we said that we would assume the market risk and purchase a certain number of packets from the two main manufacturers of these packets in Nigeria. If we could get the price first to $1, which we did, and today we have more than a third of the country covered with ORS zinc distribution. And the cost today is about 49 cents.
These preventable challenges are what frustrates you the most, aren't they? That it's there, but we're just not attacking it.
What frustrates me the most is when we know how to solve things and we don't solve them. So sometimes those are things that are preventable, and sometimes they're things that we have to ameliorate or mitigate.
So is there something in particular, this is your first time at South by?
It is.
Right?
I'm thrilled, and I'm thrilled to be on the stage with you, Bob.
Is there something in particular that this community, the technology community, you think can do to help solve some of those problems?
Well, I think certainly there are places where we still haven't figured out what works, but I think our greater challenge now is that almost every challenge has been solved by somebody somewhere. And we need more transparency into what really works. So I now know a lot about what works in the global health and the agriculture space because we do a lot of work there. But I still, as I said in my remarks earlier, really can't say with a high level of certainty if what we're doing is the best answer or not. And so I think really where we could use a lot of help, and this is something I was talking about last week at the UN around interventions to empower women and girls, is we really need standardized metrics, and then we really need a solutions hub that's agnostic, that candidly is developed by someone in this room, and not someone who has a vested interest because we're engaged in doing the work, either from a donor government perspective, a foundation perspective, or an NGO perspective, to really help us assess and then triage kind of what's working best and what's not, so that we can double down on our efforts in the former and get out of the latter.
I loved your slide where you said innovative isn't always new, because innovation really is about impact, and that's what you're looking
I agree.
for, right?
I think there's a lot of pressure to be first, particularly in America. We love people who are the first to jump the highest or to do something that's never been done before. And I think that pressure and that celebration is important, and it's part of what I think continues to ensure that we're the greatest country on earth. But I also think it's important to focus on what's working and to celebrate those who have the courage to be second or third, particularly in the development space, when I would argue kind of we don't need the same level of competition that we all might benefit from, say, in the technology space.
Do you think of yourself as a technologist?
I mean, I think we're all technologists,
Yeah.
hopefully, right? I mean, I hope we all figure out how to use technology to advance whatever it is that we want to do in our lives or on a given day, and whether that's to connect with our family and friends or to help solve a development conundrum.
Who do you think has a better chance of sort of having a large impact on the poorest parts of the world? Sort of tech innovators or policymakers?
I think that's a false dichotomy, because I think that we need policymakers to set the conditions, to incentivize tech innovators to help solve the challenges where we haven't yet solved the challenges. For example, I think in the energy space, there are a lot of things that we haven't figured out yet. But I also think we need technology innovators and inventors and creators to help us really sort through what's working and what's not, to systematize that, and then to evangelize about what's working.
You talked about the No Ceilings initiative and the quest for data out of that. And my understanding is that there has been data for some time that's sort of the best way to elevate a community, developing community, was by helping the women and girls in that community. And that data exists, and yet that data doesn't seem to have necessarily created an avalanche of change in the way development money is spent. Is the problem that the data isn't quite good enough, or that we're not responding to it?
Well, Bob, I think that's candidly where we need people like you and people in the media to help us, particularly in the United States and in the developed world. So to break down your question a little bit, in the developed world, we do have lots of data that demonstrates irrefutably that investing in, enfranchising, empowering women and girls is good for everybody. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. Women's entrance into the labor force in the United States, for example, from 1970 until 2009, added more than $2.5 trillion to our GDP alone, controlling for all other factors. So we know that this is the right and the smart thing to do. There's also a lot of data that, or forecasts that have come out of the World Economic Forum that if women participated in the labor force of Germany, for example, at the same level as men, the German GDP would grow 11% over the next decade. The Italian GDP similarly would grow 22% over the next decade. If Japanese women participated in the labor force at the same rate as Japanese men, Japan wouldn't be constantly worried about deflation and whether or not they'd ever get back on a growth trajectory, because per capita income would rise about 14% between 2015 and 2020. So we need to do a better job of disseminating that data, making that data feel relevant to young people so that we care about that data and feel inspired, empowered, and hopefully obligated to act on it. But we actually need similar data in the developing world. We don't have good data yet about what the entrance of women into the labor force in much of the developing world has really contributed in a hard dollar amount to those GDPs, and we need similar forecasts to demonstrate that if women were to enter at the same rates, they could similarly contribute to the GDP or the per capita income growth of their country at double digits.
So it's hard to know what our return on investment is then without that data there.
Well, we certainly know what our return on investment is here in the developed world. But we don't have the same levels of data that we need for the developing world.
So we have a bunch of questions from folks out here that have come on Twitter. Are you okay to
Go for it, Bob.
Go to it? All right, so...
I'm just thrilled that Twitter's working again.
Yes. So I guess the first question here is, what do you think about when you need an infusion of inspiration?
Well, I think about my grandmother, first and foremost, because she really did have a life out of Charles Dickens, and she refused to be defined by that. And then I think about other role models. On International Women's Day, on Saturday, I changed my profile picture to Wangari Maathai, who's one of my heroes, who started the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, and whose life really is a testament to lots of little steps can add up to something quite profound and magnificent and huge. She was a professor at the University of Nairobi, and she was very upset by kind of the ongoing deforestation that she saw happening around Nairobi. And so she literally just started planting trees, and then she would give her students extra credit if they would come help her plant trees. And then by the time she died, she had personally planted or helped organize the planting of more than 1 million trees across Kenya. And she ultimately, and I think appropriately, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think about people who've overcome obstacles that I candidly couldn't even fathom, like my grandmother. And I think about people who ultimately did very big things, who started with very small steps.
Growing up in the governor's mansion and the White House, you had experiences that a lot of us haven't had. Is there an experience that you look back on that you sort of wish everyone in this room could have had, that if they had been there and been able to see this, they would sort of feel this the way you do?
I don't think that I would have one experience that I could point to. I had dinner with my parents almost every night. And when my father ran for president in '92, back when campaigns were 13 months and not 3 years, which seems to be the weird paradigm that we're living in at the moment, or at least the expectation therein. During those 13 months, I was with one or both of my parents, generally at home, all but 3 nights. And so I always very much felt like I was the most important person in the world to them. And I think that that feeling and kind of confidence of being rooted in my family is profoundly important, and a gift that my parents gave me that I continue to clearly be nourished by. But I think even more pertinent to your question is that, the first thing I learned how to read was the newspaper. And from my earliest memories, we would talk at the dinner table about what was happening in the world. And my parents expected me to have views and opinions and to be able to defend them. I mean, the first debate that my parents engaged me in, literally a debate, was when I was 6 years old. and I had to debate against one of my parents, and the other would play the moderator.
That sounds easy. Yeah.
So, you know, I
That's
think
just what we all want to do.
yeah, I'm sure.
Debate
I'm sure.
your parents. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and when you're 6, nonetheless, right? But I think that that was great for me because it taught me early, particularly as a girl and a young woman, that not only was it okay to have an opinion and a point of view, but that I was expected to have an opinion and a point of view.
Are there things that you taught your parents? You're talking about things they taught you, but learning from their child, what things you teach them?
I mean, I definitely taught my parents how to text and how to charge their phones, which was, I remember, a very mysterious thing for them at the beginning. And so there's some functional things like that that I'm
charging
sure,
the phones was mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know. I'm sure that that's not uncommon for many of us in this room, having taught our parents. My grandmother, before she passed away, was an avid user of her iPad, which I always thought was pretty amazing, that kind of at 90 she'd learned to use an iPad, which she used every day until she died when she was 92. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've taught my parents, which isn't really something maybe that I had to teach them so much as to remind them, is that we always have to include young voices in whatever it is we're doing, particularly when we think about any of our work in the development space. More than 70% of sub-Saharan Africa is under 30. So whatever challenge we're trying to solve, if we want the problem solving itself to be credible, but also for the solution to be credible, we have to enfranchise and engage young people from the beginning.
So another question from the audience is, do you intend to actively join U.S. politics? Are you going to go into politics?
Well, Bob, I don't know. For a long time, my answer to that question was no, because one of my earliest memories is being 3 years old and being on the campaign trail with my father. Arkansas was the last state in the country to move away from 2-year gubernatorial election cycles to 4-year election cycles. And so my dad was, it felt like, perpetually running for governor when I was a little girl. And so I was 3 years old, and I remember being at a campaign rally and waving an American flag. And this older woman came up to me and said, you know, Chelsea, are you going to run for governor of Arkansas one day? It's kind of great that she asked me that I was a little girl and not a little boy. But I remember looking at her and saying, no, I'm 3, I'm just waving the flag. Like, I know that's my job right now, is like wave the flag.
And that was enough.
Yeah, and that was enough. And so, you know, I just kept answering no. I think partly because for most of my life, my mother was not in government service. She was engaged in the Legal Defense Services Corps in Arkansas and at a national level. She led education reform efforts in Arkansas and at a national level when I was little. And clearly, as First Lady, I saw all the work that she could do sort of in the political system, but still outside of it. And so I very much had a real-life example my whole life of the fact that there are many ways in which to engage in the world and to advance positive change. And now I don't know. I mean, in 2008, when I went on the campaign trail for my mother and did more than 400 events in 40 states, including right here in Texas, and talked to so many young people about why I so passionately supported my mom, not only as a daughter, but as a young woman, as a self-identified progressive. I really, I think, understood in a new and more intimate way why it really matters who's in the political arena. And at the moment, I find it pretty discouraging that almost none of my friends think about running for public office as an option in their lives. When my father graduated from Georgetown, he thinks probably half his friends thought about running for political office. His ambition was not unique. And so I find that really troubling, that so many of my friends who are doing important, disruptive work, whether it's in technology or policy, would never think about running for political office. But I do think there are many ways to engage and make a difference in the world. And right now, for me, I think the best way that I can engage and make a difference in the world is through the Clinton Foundation. I also live in a city and a state and a country where I support my elected representatives. So if at some point that weren't the case, and I didn't support my mayor or my city councilwoman or my congresswoman or either of my senators, and I'm lucky to live in a state where I have lots of women representing me, you know, maybe then I'd have to ask and answer the question for myself and come to a different answer.
Why do you think it's changed so much? I mean, I know there are a lot of reasons, but...
I think it's changed for both really affirmative reasons and really unfortunate reasons. I think it's changed for really affirmative reasons because there are so many options and outlets now for people to feel engaged and connected with ways in which each of us wants to make a difference. A little bit of what I talked about in my remarks. I don't know if, 20 years ago, Ben Rattray may have wanted to run for political office. I don't know.
And now he feels like he can make change through change.org.
Through change.org. Yeah. So I think it's both for affirmative reasons. Kind of there are more mechanisms in which each of us can engage or which we can invent. And then I think it's also for really unfortunate reasons because we live in a 24-hour news cycle, because what seems to get the most attention is sort of the most negative and vituperative and vicious, and not the most innovative and imaginative and productive of what's happening in Washington. So I think it's both for really good and really lamentable reasons.
All right, I should go to another question here. Do you agree with Sheryl Sandberg's lean-in approach? What professional advice do you have for women?
I certainly agree with Sheryl's latest effort to ban Bossy. I was one of those girls who I have vivid memories of teachers saying things to my parents like, Ma, your daughter, she's just so precocious. And they didn't mean it as a compliment. Although, thankfully, my parents would always tell me in the car ride home after our parent-teacher conference, that's awesome that you're really precocious. So I'm lucky that I had parents who were always there with an antidote to whatever subtle or not so subtle signals of discouragement I was getting. And I do agree kind of with Sheryl's schematic that we need to change many of the structures in which women engage in the workforce. I mean, it is an issue that many of our competitors give 6 or 12 months of maternity leave mandated by law, and we give none. I think that's an issue. I think that that kind of continues to constrain the ways in which women can fully participate. But I also think there are social and cultural dynamics that do need to change, even more profoundly than Bossy, ban Bossy, although I think that's part of it. One of the things that Sheryl has talked a lot about, as have my mom and me, are the critical years of middle school for girls. Because in 4th grade, girls are just as good in math as boys are, and just as many want to be engineers or astronauts or geneticists or tech innovators. And by 8th grade, that's no longer true. And so we know that something happens in those critical years where girls are told either, don't worry about it, you don't need to be good at math, or maybe this area, reading, history, social studies, might be a better match for you. Or maybe boys are called more on in class. We actually know that's true. Particularly in math class, boys are twice as likely to be called on than girls to answer a math question. So we know we need to change all of that so that we're not losing half of our country's ability to contribute to our workforce today or our imagination for tomorrow.
All right, next question. How can we encourage break down the silos between NGOs, government, business, et cetera?
Well, certainly at the Clinton Foundation, we just act as if the silos don't exist. And we certainly convene what historically have been really unlikely partners to try to tackle specific challenges, whether in the health space around the world or to combat childhood obesity here in the United States. The Clinton Foundation got into the work of childhood obesity after my father's heart scare in 2004. We call it a heart scare because that just sounds a lot less scary than the quadruple bypass surgery that he actually had. But in early 2005, when he called the American Heart Association to ask what he could do on heart health, he certainly wasn't expecting their answer, which was to help on childhood obesity. And today, I think there's much greater awareness about what an urgent challenge this is here in the United States. 1 out of 3 American kids between the ages of 6 and 19 is overweight or obese. In New York City, in our kindergarten system, 1 out of 5 kids is obese. That's 5-year-olds. And whatever people care about, and this is now something I talk about, again, like diarrhea, wherever I can, because if people care about our economic competitiveness, increasingly, particularly in high school, teachers are saying that kids are not performing as well academically because they're just too tired, because they're just too overweight. Or kids are being diagnosed at younger and younger ages for heart disease. Last year in the United States, we had a 6-year-old diagnosed with heart disease. We have rising rates of diagnosis for adult onset diabetes in preteens and teenagers. So if you care about our economic competitiveness, you need to care about this because our kids aren't learning as much or performing as well in school. If you care about socioeconomics or social justice, you need to care about this because it disproportionately falls on racial minorities and low-income Americans. If you care about our security, you need to care about this. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a call to action in 2012 to reverse childhood obesity because the U.S. Marines and the U.S. Army were for the first time seeing more people show up who could not pass basic training than could pass basic training. So whatever it is that people care about, people should care about childhood obesity. And so when we think about what we can do in childhood obesity, one of the things that we've worked really hard to do is to bring together unlikely partners, and often partners which historically had a lot of stigma in this debate. So we do work with the American Beverage Association, for example. And when we started working with the American Beverage Association in 2006, there was great kind of, I mean, not just skepticism, but cynicism. Like, why are you talking to Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper? These are the worst offenders. Well, because their products are in our schools. And so by talking to them, we were able to negotiate a decrease in 90% of the calories shipped to American schools between 2006 and 2010. So now there's flavored water and diet sodas that are sold in school vending machines, but you don't find full-calorie sodas any longer. We work with McDonald's. We work with where kids are so that there are healthier options for kids and also healthier options for their parents or their teachers who are really their role models. So we try to then role model for other foundations and NGOs that often you have to start with where you are, and you have to look for who your natural partners are, even if they may not be your ideal partners.
I have to ask this question. If your breakfast taco had to have 3 things in it, what would they be?
I love breakfast tacos, so that's actually very easy. Well, one, sensitive to gluten, so it'd have to be a corn tortilla, but I think that's okay anyway. So a corn tortilla. Wait, do eggs, are they one of my ingredients or no?
Sure, yeah,
Shoot.
if you want them to be.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, I have to have eggs. I have to have eggs. I have to have...
Not egg whites, not...
Eggs, jalapenos, and peppers.
All right.
I'm glad you approve.
All right. I think we'll move to another question. What impact do you think technology can have to rid corruption in the developing world?
I think that is a terrific question, partly because corruption is both a lot worse and a lot less worse than people think it is. And
a lot less worse.
And I mean that in a couple ways. I think that there are some countries where corruption is very endemic. And there are others where it's not very endemic. But unfortunately, corruption is often this like broad stroke that is used to just exonerate people from trying to make a difference in the world. So I actually think that this is a crucially important question because I think it also would help hold donors accountable for not being able to say no and use corruption as an excuse, but also then to know more about where our dollars are flowing and how. So ideally, you would figure out some way to really track the money. You would figure out how to electronically tag the money and track the money, whether it's dollars or yen or euros, and kind of where it's going to whom. Ideally, if you could also track the money, you would not only then be assured that part of it wasn't being siphoned off into the local police commissioner or the local finance minister's pocket, but you would also know really where the dollars were flowing. For example, if I look at a USAID contract, at least what is publicly available, I can't tell what contractors USAID is employing to do what work where. I certainly can't see then what subcontractors, the contractors that USAID is engaged with, are then doing what work and where, or how they're tracking it or measuring success. So I actually think coming up with technological solutions that are ostensibly about things like corruption would also really help ensure there was a lot greater transparency and accountability just in general in financial flows with where money is going and to whom.
And let them applaud you. And this, the technology you're talking about, it's not like this is technology that doesn't exist. This is technology we have, it's just not implemented, right? It's not in place.
Or it hasn't been applied. Right, so I think we have a couple challenges in development. Sometimes there's technology that exists in theory, but hasn't really been applied. And then there's some technologies that don't really exist in such a way that they're equally valid in sort of a high-tech environment like Washington and a low-tech environment like Maputo in Mozambique. And that is a challenge that we do have to solve.
Right. Well, it looks like we have time for one more question. So this is from Greg McCarthy. With lots of innovative minds in this room, what's your closing advice on making an impact on the world?
Well, I would focus on kind of what you're most passionate about, what makes you angry. Like childhood diarrhea makes me really angry. And I think that asking ourselves questions like those, like what makes me angry? What do I think is really unjust? What do I think is unfair? And then trying to match that against where do I think I can make a difference, that should be the starting point for how each of us engage in the world. And I know that sometimes it can be daunting, and we all care a lot about a lot of different things. But there are some things, at least for me, that I do care more passionately about, and there are some things that really do make me angry. And so then those are my starting points for determining whether or not my skills, my talents, the resources of the Clinton Foundation can be mustered against those, or whether or not someone else is much better situated to tackle those. And then I would look for organizations that either you respect because of how they go about doing their work, or because you respect the people who are leading them, and offer your talents, your energies, your expertise, and really your imaginations, and not wait too long. Because if you wait too long, inertia is a super powerful force. So if you're feeling invigorated after today, I hope you'll go out and do something, sign up, and make a difference.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.